Welcome to Dark Crime Mysteries. Today, we're diving into a story filled with tragedy, deception, and ambition. On the surface, the Roberts family seems perfect: a successful father, a talented stepmother, and a son finding his way. But behind this glossy exterior, there are simmering conflicts, betrayal, and a dangerous game of power. As secrets can no longer stay hidden, everything spirals into a deadly chain of events. Follow this gripping tale to uncover the truth behind the inevitable downfall of this family. To their neighbors, the Roberts family is the embodiment of the American dream. At 45, Ryan Roberts is a successful financial investor, always seen in crisp Brooks Brothers suits, a symbol of power and prestige. Beside him is Melanie, his stunning 38-year-old second wife, a talented interior designer with a flair for personal style. Their seemingly complete life includes Nate, Ryan's son from his first marriage. At 20, Nate is trying to find his place in life after dropping out of college. He now works as a mechanic at a local garage but carries a lot of resentment and emotional scars from the past. From the outside, the Roberts family appears to be enjoying prosperity and happiness. Ryan has a solid career, while Melanie is beginning to make a name for herself in Oakdale's interior design scene. Although Nate seems brooding and has a complicated past, he's starting to settle into his job at the garage. However, beneath this perfect exterior lies a family filled with conflict and hidden secrets. Small cracks are starting to show in their relationships, creating a fragile foundation that could collapse at any moment. Ryan had gone through a tumultuous marriage before meeting Melanie. His first wife, Helen, was a free-spirited artist with a strong personality. However, their marriage quickly fell apart as they were unable to reconcile their differences. During that time, Nate often witnessed his parents' explosive arguments. When the divorce was finalized, Nate's deep emotional wounds left him with lingering resentment and bitterness that have been hard to shake. 3 years after his divorce, Ryan met Melanie at a charity gala. Melanie made an impression, not only with her long dark hair but also with her sharp wit and subtle sense of humor. Having grown up in the foster care system, Melanie longed for the stability of a family life she had never known. To her, Ryan, with his financial security and disciplined lifestyle, seemed like the perfect missing piece. Less than a year later, they were married, and Melanie moved into Ryan's home, the same house where Ryan's family once lived, believing she had finally found the peace she sought. However, Nate, now 14, was far from welcoming his new stepmother. He saw Melanie as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in his family. Every attempt Melanie made to connect with Nate was met with cold indifference and resistance. Nate openly displayed his hostility, seeing Melanie as an unworthy replacement for his mother. His cold glares and harsh words gradually wore Melanie down, and she eventually gave up on trying to bridge the gap between them. Ryan, in an attempt to avoid conflict, pretended not to notice the tension between his wife and son. He hoped that time would heal the wounds, but reality proved otherwise. Nate became increasingly distant, while Melanie, unable to cope with the stress and disappointment, withdrew into her work. She fully immersed herself in her design career, mingling with the town's elite, and spent less and less time at home. This only deepened the divide between her and Nate, while Ryan buried himself further in his work, leaving the family's growing cracks unaddressed. As Nate entered his teenage years, his defiance grew stronger. His hostility toward Melanie intensified, and he began neglecting his studies, sinking deeper into rebellious behavior. He frequently skipped school, associated with the wrong crowd, and started experimenting with drugs. Petty thefts soon made their way onto Nate's list of reckless actions. This loss of control further strained his already fragile relationship with his father. Ryan, who had long since run out of patience, grew increasingly disappointed in his son. But rather than confronting the issue, Ryan chose to avoid conflict, only making matters worse. Melanie, who had given up hope of building a relationship with Nate, found herself caught in the unwanted conflict between father and son. Arguments between Ryan and Nate became more frequent, and Melanie was often left bearing the emotional fallout. She was constantly stuck between Ryan's frustration and Nate's rebellion. Though she tried to stay out of it, she couldn't escape the growing tension within the family. The breaking point came when Nate decided to drop out of college and take a job at a local garage. While it seemed like he had found his path, in reality, he was simply running away from his family's control. Nate's life became increasingly unstable, and the strain between him and Melanie remained as strong as ever. Each day in the Roberts household was a silent, ongoing battle among family members who couldn't find understanding. This was the moment when tragedy loomed, as a random event on a sweltering afternoon would shatter the fragile shell holding the family together, starting with an unexpected discovery by Nate. On a sweltering July afternoon, Nate came home earlier than usual after a long, exhausting day at the garage. His head throbbed from the hangover he was nursing from the night before, and all he wanted was to find some aspirin to ease the pain. The house was unusually quiet, with Ryan away on a business trip and Melanie out on one of her design consultations. Nate, restless and irritable, made his way upstairs, searching for pain relief in his father and stepmother's bathroom, a place he rarely ventured into. As Nate rummaged through the medicine drawer, the familiar vibration of a phone on the nightstand caught his attention. It was Melanie's phone, left behind in her rush to leave that morning. A devilish curiosity flickered in Nate's mind, and without hesitation, he picked up the phone and began to scroll through the notifications. His eyes narrowed as one particular message caught his attention, a message from someone named Xavier Kinski. The tone was unmistakably intimate. "I can't wait to see you, my love." Nate's heart raced as he delved deeper into the messages, each one more revealing than the last. The exchange between Melanie and Xavier painted a clear picture of a passionate affair, filled with secret rendezvous, whispers of love, and promises of a future together. The more he read, the more anger and disgust swelled within him. This wasn't just an innocent flirtation. Melanie had betrayed his father in the most unforgivable way possible. For years, Nate had harbored a deep resentment towards his stepmother. He blamed her for his fractured relationship with his father and for the emotional scars that still lingered from his parents' divorce. Now, holding proof of Melanie's betrayal in his hands, he felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. It was as if the universe had finally given him the opportunity to make her pay for everything she had put him through. But this wasn't just about revenge. Nate saw an opportunity, a way to turn Melanie's secret into leverage. He didn't want to simply expose her, he wanted to control her. With the weight of this new discovery, Nate's mind raced with the possibilities. How far could he push her? What would she be willing to do to keep this hidden? Later that evening, when Melanie returned home, she found Nate sitting in the kitchen, his eyes gleaming with a strange, unsettling intensity. She greeted him casually, but something in his demeanor made her uneasy. Before she could react, Nate casually mentioned the name Xavier, watching as her face went pale. In that moment, Melanie knew her world was about to crumble. Nate had discovered her secret, and there was no way out. Nate didn't waste time with small talk. With chilling precision, he recounted everything he had read on her phone. Every incriminating detail, every damning message. Melanie's attempts to deny it were futile. She was trapped, and Nate made it clear that he now held all the power. He could destroy her life with a single word to Ryan, and Melanie, terrified of the consequences, found herself at Nate's mercy. Melanie froze in place, her breath catching in her throat as Nate's words hung heavy in the air. The kitchen, usually filled with warmth and light, felt suddenly cold and oppressive. She could barely form words as Nate began to calmly recount every detail he had uncovered from her phone. The secret messages, the intimate moments she had shared with Xavier. Nate knew everything. His voice was disturbingly calm, a stark contrast to the storm that raged inside her. At first, Melanie attempted to deny it, but Nate was relentless. Every denial she offered was met with another cold fact, another damning piece of evidence he had discovered. When it became clear that there was no escaping the truth, Melanie's defenses crumbled. Her initial defiance gave way to desperation, and she began pleading with Nate, her voice trembling. She begged him not to tell Ryan, her mind racing through the consequences of such a revelation. Ryan's trust in her would be shattered, their marriage destroyed, and her reputation in the town irreparably tarnished. But Nate wasn't interested in forgiveness or reconciliation. He had no intention of simply holding the secret over Melanie's head as a threat. He wanted something more tangible, something that would benefit him directly. Leaning back in his chair, Nate finally revealed his demand, $1,000 a month. If Melanie wanted to keep her affair hidden, she would have to pay for his silence. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Nate. Melanie, the woman he had despised for years, was now at his mercy, forced to comply with his demands. Melanie's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to comprehend the situation. She offered excuses, promises to make things right, but Nate remained unmoved. His smirk never wavered. He had the upper hand, and he wasn't going to let this opportunity slip through his fingers. In the end, with no other options, Melanie reluctantly agreed to his terms, her mind racing with fear and guilt. She had no idea how long she could maintain this charade, but for now, she was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. As the days passed, Nate became increasingly emboldened. The initial $1,000 was only the beginning. He started pushing boundaries, testing the limits of his newfound power. When Ryan was away on business trips, Nate hosted parties in their house, ignoring Melanie's protests. He took Ryan's prized possessions for joyrides, leaving Melanie to explain the damages. Each new transgression was another reminder of the control Nate held over her life. Melanie, once confident and composed, now moved through the house like a shadow of her former self. She couldn't escape the growing tension, the constant fear that her secret would be exposed. Nate's demands weighed heavily on her, and she found herself slipping further into despair. Every day was a battle, and Melanie knew that if something didn't change soon, her entire world would come crashing down. To make matters worse, Nate's defiance wasn't limited to Melanie. He began openly challenging his father's authority as well, growing bolder with each passing day. His once hidden rebellion became blatant acts of disrespect, further straining the already fragile relationships within the household. Yet, Melanie felt powerless to intervene, terrified that any action she took might provoke Nate into revealing everything. The tension between them reached its peak one evening when Nate, emboldened by his power, demanded even more from Melanie. Not content with just financial gain, he began to push for control in other aspects of their lives. He wanted freedom without limits, a life where he answered to no one. And with the leverage he held over Melanie, he was confident she wouldn't dare defy him. The arrangement between Nate and Melanie soon became a toxic cycle. Every month, Melanie handed over the $1,000, and every month, Nate found new ways to exploit his control over her. His power grew, not just financially but emotionally, and Melanie felt herself sinking deeper into a pit of helplessness. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on her with every passing day, suffocating her under the weight of her own lies and Nate's escalating demands. Nate reveled in his dominance. He no longer felt the need to hide his contempt for Melanie or even pretend to respect the household rules. With Ryan away, Nate acted with impunity, hosting parties, inviting unsavory friends over, and using Ryan's possessions as if they were his own. Melanie, powerless to stop him, could only watch as her home descended into chaos. She knew that any protest, any attempt to regain control, would only lead to Nate tightening his grip. Things escalated when Nate demanded more than just money. He began expecting Melanie to treat him with special favor, whether it was preparing his meals, running errands for him, or even defending him when Ryan grew suspicious of his behavior. Nate thrived on pushing her to her limits, testing how far she would go to keep her secret safe. Each new demand chipped away at Melanie's resolve, leaving her feeling more trapped and isolated than ever before. Melanie's life had turned into a waking nightmare, one that she couldn't seem to escape from. She avoided Ryan as much as possible, fearful that any interaction would give away the guilt gnawing at her insides. But Ryan was no fool. He noticed the shift in the household, the tension that hung thick in the air. Melanie could feel his eyes on her, probing for answers she wasn't ready to give. And though he hadn't yet confronted her, she knew it was only a matter of time before he did. But Melanie's greatest fear wasn't Ryan, it was Nate. Every time he pushed her further, she could see the contempt in his eyes growing stronger. He no longer viewed her as his stepmother, she was just a pawn in his game of control. And Melanie, once the confident and independent woman, found herself crumbling under the weight of his manipulation. The breaking point came one evening when Nate confronted Melanie with a new demand, $1,500 a month. He claimed that the original arrangement was no longer enough, especially with the risk he was taking by keeping her secret. Melanie was stunned, her mind reeling as she tried to figure out how she could possibly withdraw such a large sum without raising Ryan's suspicions. When she protested, Nate's response was chilling. He revealed that he had found intimate photos of her and Xavier on her phone. If she didn't comply with his new demand, he threatened to send the photos to Ryan, ensuring that her entire life would come crashing down in a matter of seconds. The cold malice in his voice left no room for negotiation. Melanie, cornered and terrified, had no choice but to agree to his terms. The once polished and confident woman that Melanie had been was now a shell of herself. Her career suffered as she struggled to maintain her composure, her clients noticing the shift in her work. She could no longer focus on her designs, and the anxiety gnawed at her, making her days a living nightmare. Each day that passed, Melanie felt more and more trapped. The guilt, the fear, the constant manipulation from Nate, all of it was taking a toll on her mental state. She knew that if something didn't change soon, she would lose everything. Desperation clawed at her, and in her darkest moment, she made a decision. She would reach out to Xavier for help. Nate's thirst for control over Melanie grew with every passing day. What had started as a financial arrangement now spiraled into a twisted game of dominance. The $1,500 Nate demanded wasn't enough to satiate his growing appetite for power. Every time Melanie complied, it emboldened him further, pushing him to test her limits in more disturbing ways. His once subtle acts of rebellion became brazen, with Nate now openly defying Melanie's authority in the household. Ryan's frequent business trips provided Nate with ample opportunities to indulge in his reckless behavior. On one particular evening, after Melanie had reluctantly handed over the money, Nate went a step further. He invited a group of rowdy friends to their house, turning the quiet suburban home into the scene of a chaotic party. Loud music blared through the walls, bottles clinked, and laughter echoed through the once peaceful residence. Melanie, feeling trapped and powerless, watched from the sidelines, her heart sinking deeper into despair. Nate had transformed the house into his personal playground. He used Ryan's prized possessions without permission, including his beloved vintage car. When he damaged the vehicle during a joyride, he shamelessly left the scratches for Melanie to explain. It was as though Nate took pleasure in seeing her squirm under the weight of the lies, knowing she couldn't risk exposing him for fear of losing everything. As tensions escalated, Nate's demands grew even more outrageous. He began to expect Melanie's complete submission, forcing her to cater to his whims at every turn. Whether it was demanding meals at odd hours, asking her to run personal errands, or subtly undermining her in front of Ryan, Nate thrived on making her feel small and insignificant. Each time Melanie tried to assert herself, Nate would remind her of the damning evidence he held: the affair with Xavier, the incriminating photos. She was trapped in a vicious cycle of manipulation and fear, unable to break free. Nights became the most unbearable for Melanie. Every evening, she lay awake, her mind racing with dread. What would Nate demand next? How long could she keep up this charade? And what would happen if Ryan ever discovered the truth? The pressure was suffocating, and Melanie felt her carefully constructed life crumbling around her. It was in one of these moments of desperation that Melanie made a fateful decision. She would turn to Xavier, the only person she believed could help her out of this mess. But little did she know, the choice to involve Xavier would only plunge her deeper into the nightmare. As days turned into weeks, Nate's behavior spiraled further out of control. He began skipping work, spending more time at home, and making life unbearable for Melanie. He no longer cared about hiding his disdain for her, openly mocking her in front of her guests and making crude remarks about her appearance. Melanie, who had once been a respected figure in the town's interior design community, now felt like a stranger in her own life. The more Nate pushed, the more she withdrew, feeling utterly powerless and isolated. One night, after an especially difficult encounter with Nate, Melanie sat alone in the darkened living room, her mind racing. She couldn't keep living like this, something had to change. She picked up her phone and, with trembling hands, dialed Xavier's number. The decision to involve him would set in motion events she could never have imagined, but at that moment, all she could think about was finding a way out of Nate's suffocating grip. Driven to the brink by Nate's escalating demands and her growing sense of entrapment, Melanie sought out Xavier in a desperate plea for help. Although she knew reaching out to him was a dangerous gamble, she had no other option. She needed someone who could take control of the situation, someone who could stand up to Nate in ways she couldn't. And Xavier, despite the risks, seemed like her only hope. One cold December day, Melanie arranged a secret meeting with Xavier at a secluded motel on the outskirts of town. It was the same place where they had met in the early days of their affair, back when passion and excitement had clouded her judgment. But this time, the air between them was different. Melanie was no longer the confident woman who had captivated Xavier's attention. She was broken, her spirit crushed under the weight of Nate's control. When she finally met Xavier, her anxiety was palpable. Her voice trembled as she recounted the situation, explaining how Nate had discovered their affair and was now blackmailing her for money. Every word dripped with fear and helplessness as she pleaded for Xavier to help her escape from Nate's tightening grip. Melanie's hope clung to the idea that Xavier would step in as her savior, ready to take decisive action to end the nightmare she was living in. But as Melanie poured out her story, Xavier's demeanor shifted. He sat quietly, listening to her with an icy gaze, his face devoid of the warmth and affection she had once known. His responses were measured, calculated. Though he reassured her that he would handle everything, there was an edge to his voice that made Melanie uneasy. It wasn't concern she saw in his eyes anymore, it was calculation. Xavier had his own interests to protect, and Nate's blackmail threatened not only Melanie's life but his as well. For Xavier, this wasn't about helping Melanie. It was about neutralizing a threat. He couldn't afford for Nate to expose their affair, not with so much at stake. Xavier promised Melanie that he would take care of the situation, but in his mind, he had already begun formulating a plan, one far more sinister than anything Melanie had imagined. She had no idea that by turning to Xavier, she had unleashed a chain of events that would lead to even darker consequences. As Xavier listened to Melanie's increasingly frantic pleas, his mind was racing, calculating the best way to handle this growing problem. He didn't view Nate as an obstacle, he saw him as a liability. Melanie, blinded by her desperation, couldn't see the dangerous shift in Xavier's demeanor. She clung to the hope that he would protect her, but she had no idea the lengths he was willing to go to. Over the next few days, Xavier quietly set his plan in motion. He started by gathering information about Nate, his routines, his workplace, his weaknesses. Xavier was meticulous, leaving no detail unchecked. He knew that the only way to solve this problem was to remove Nate from the equation entirely. And in Xavier's mind, that meant more than just confronting the young man, it meant ensuring that Nate could never threaten them again. Meanwhile, Melanie continued to live in fear, though a small part of her felt a sliver of relief, believing that Xavier would protect her. She had no idea that the man she had turned to for help was about to set a deadly plan in motion. With his plan carefully laid out, Xavier prepared to take action. He knew he needed to eliminate Nate, but it had to be done discreetly. No one could trace it back to him or Melanie. His first step was to arrange a meeting with Nate, offering what seemed like a generous proposal, $50,000 to leave town and forget everything he knew about the affair. It was a calculated move, meant to test Nate's greed and give him one last chance to walk away. But Xavier was prepared for the worst if things didn't go as planned. The meeting took place at the garage where Nate worked. The dimly lit surroundings added a layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. When Nate arrived, his arrogance was on full display. He listened to Xavier's offer with a smirk, confident that he still held the upper hand. The $50,000 didn't impress him. In fact, it only emboldened him further. Nate scoffed at the offer, making it clear that he wasn't interested in money. He wanted more, and if he didn't get it, he threatened to expose everything to Ryan. His smugness was a provocation that Xavier had anticipated, but it was also the push that sent Xavier over the edge. Xavier realized that Nate had no intention of backing down. The only solution now was to silence him for good. He lured Nate to a more secluded location, a deserted area near an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. It was the perfect place for what Xavier had in mind. He brought a suitcase filled with cash, knowing full well that this wasn't a negotiation. This was the final act. When Nate arrived at the factory, his bravado was still intact. He strutted in with the confidence of someone who believed they were untouchable. But Xavier had no intention of letting this play out any further. As soon as Nate started making demands, the tension snapped. Xavier's calm facade broke, and before Nate could react, Xavier pulled out a knife concealed in his jacket. A brutal struggle ensued. Nate, though younger and stronger, was caught off guard by Xavier's ruthlessness. The two men fought fiercely in the cold, deserted expanse of the factory grounds, their breaths turning to mist in the frigid air. But Xavier had the element of surprise, and in a critical moment, he overpowered Nate. With a swift, violent motion, Xavier plunged the knife into Nate's abdomen, the young man's scream piercing the silence. Nate struggled, his body convulsing as blood poured from the wound. Xavier, fueled by a cold, calculated rage, didn't stop there. He stabbed Nate twice more in the chest, ensuring there would be no chance of survival. The life drained from Nate's eyes as his body went limp, collapsing onto the ground in a pool of blood. The once cocky, rebellious young man had met his end, his arrogance costing him everything. Xavier stood over the lifeless body, his chest heaving as he tried to regain control of his breathing. His hands were stained with blood, but his mind was already racing with the next steps. He had to dispose of the body, cover his tracks, and ensure that no one would ever connect him to this murder. Quietly, methodically, Xavier dragged Nate's body to a concealed spot near the factory, where he had already prepared a place to hide it. The darkness swallowed up the scene, leaving no trace of what had just occurred. Unbeknownst to Melanie, her plea for help had set off a deadly chain of events. As she sat at home, still fearful of Nate's control, she had no idea that her stepson was already dead, his life snuffed out by the man she had trusted to save her. But in a town like Oakdale, secrets never stay buried for long. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. If you were captivated by this true crime story and want to see more thrilling cases, please hit the like button to support us. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who also loves real-life crime stories and leave a comment below with your thoughts on the case. Be sure to subscribe to the Dark Crime Mysteries channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on the latest gripping cases that you won't want to miss. Thank you for your support.